There we go.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
If you want to just count to 10 for me.
All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
He give me a
Okay.
thumbs up. Thank you,
Good.
sir.
Great.
Check this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Hey.
I want to introduce you to the other Singaporean in the audience.
Hello.
Ravi. Nice
Hi,
to meet you.
Benjamin.
Nice
yes.
to meet you. How are you?
So Ravi grew up in Singapore.
Oh.
I'm from Singapore.
Okay, okay.
And my cousin's currently at the institute, the S.
RSIS.
Rajaratnam.
Who's your cousin?
Shashi Jayakumar.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I told her.
Good evening. I want to welcome you this evening. We are going to have, the mic's not for that, the mic's for the camera. So if you could, if I could have your attention, please. We're going to have some more chairs brought in, so don't panic yet, but there's plenty of room here on the floor. So welcome tonight. My name is Randy Kluver. It's my privilege to serve as the Associate Provost and Dean of the School of Global Studies and Partnerships at Oklahoma State University. And I want to welcome everyone who's joining us tonight. You can tell it's been a while since we've had a big crowd and we're a little out of practice. So we're glad that everybody is here tonight. I particularly want to welcome the group from Jenks High School. Welcome, we're glad you're here. Very soon we expect to see you back in Stillwater wearing orange. So we do hope to see you here. We also want to thank our friends from UPAEP in Mexico, in Puebla, Mexico. Bienvenidos. We wish you were here with us, but you're welcome to join us as well. We have about 200 or so students from UPAEP who are watching us tonight online. I'm particularly happy to welcome tonight's speaker and have this talk tonight. I spent 6 years in Southeast Asia myself, particularly in Singapore, where I got to know tonight's speaker. And so for those of you who have had me in class, it is possible to study under me and still succeed in life. So, and Dr. Ho is a great example of that. But Southeast Asia is a region of the world that is often neglected in American thinking about international relations, about trade, and in so many other areas, which is a huge shame because Southeast Asia has a population of over 600 million people. Its GDP is close to $10 trillion. It's a hugely important part of the world. And yet, we in the United States are often vaguely aware of it, if at all. And we haven't really focused on Southeast Asia since we fought a war there over 50 years ago. And so we're very happy that our speaker tonight is bringing this topic. And those of us who are interested in international relations, I think it's going to be a really interesting perspective for you. So Benjamin Ho is assistant professor at the China program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS, in Singapore. He obtained his PhD from the Department of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, UK, which means I did not do too much damage when you were an undergraduate. His research focus includes the study of China's international relations with an emphasis on the Chinese political worldview and exceptionalism thinking, which I hope he'll define tonight. Other research interests include security multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region with a focus on regional institutions, national security, and the sociology of religion and public theology. He is published in the American Journal of Chinese Studies, China Quarterly, Journal of Contemporary China, East Asia, Asia Policy, Australian Journal of International Affairs, and Yale Journal of International Affairs. Since joining RSIS, Dr. Ho has been involved in a number of think tank events and conferences, including the Track 2 network of ASEAN defense and security institutions, the Pacific Young Leaders Program, and CSCAP meetings. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Ho.
Thank you, Professor Kluver, for the very kind introduction. As Professor Kluver mentioned, I was a student actually 15 years ago during my undergraduate days. And it's interesting how I got into international relations because I recall it was his module that was taught on international relations that got me interested. And interestingly, it was an elective. So it had no bearing on my grade point average, or what they call GPA on my. So in other words, the grades were irrelevant, but it got me interested in the subject, and here I am teaching international relations. So moral of the story, okay, take your electives very seriously, especially those that do not count to your grade point average, because most likely you took it for some reason that is beyond just grades. Okay, so that's just that's how I would like to introduce my acquaintance with Professor Kluver. I'm very glad to be here in Stillwater, and I hear that today is a great sunny day, very similar to the weather we get in Singapore all the time. Okay, but I hear that tomorrow is winter. So in the span of 24 hours, I would have experienced 4 seasons. Yeah, I think that only happens, that doesn't really happen in most places. So this is a very interesting experience that I'm going to have in the next half a day or so. Before I start on my presentation, I would like you guys actually at the end to ask questions. So I'll limit myself to just 25 minutes. So I'm going to start my handphone. At the 25 minutes mark, it's going to beep very loudly, and that will remind me to stop. Okay, so that you guys can ask questions. I would like to ask, before I move on, one question. How many of you have actually been to Southeast Asia? Okay, how many of you are from Southeast Asia? Okay, can you just shout out which country you're from? Southeast Asia. Okay, not counted, but anyway, it's fine. Go on. Okay. Philippines. Okay, Malaysia. Okay, how many of you have been to Southeast Asia? Okay, a few more hands. So the rest of you have not gone to South. How many of you think you know something about Southeast Asia? All right, so later, if I run into any difficult questions, those who put up your hands, I can call upon you to help answer. All right, so that's the arrangement. Okay, I'll just, but since I'm the speaker, okay, I'll just share some of my thoughts, and subsequently, I do want to really hear what questions you might have about the topic. Okay, so this is just a map of Southeast Asia, 10 countries. Okay, some Southeast Asia in numbers. So some interesting facts and figures that I only realized also myself when I was preparing these slides. So for myself, I'm not a Southeast Asian specialist per se. Okay, but I focus more on China. But in the course of my research, okay, you can't discuss China in the region without talking about Southeast Asia. Okay, so these are some generic facts. Total population, more than 600 million. Okay, so it's, if you were to put Southeast Asia as a country, of course nobody does that, but if you were to group Southeast Asia as a country, okay, it is actually the 3rd most populous, if it were a country. Total area would be the 7th largest. Okay, again, if you were to put all 10 countries together as a single geographical area. Total GDP, okay, 3.08 trillion US dollars, and 5th largest if it were a single economy. Okay, over 1,000 native languages. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, most of us only speak probably 2. I speak 3, English, Mandarin, and Malay. Okay, so there are 1,000 native languages. So you can see the rich diversity in Southeast Asia. And politically, it's very diverse. You've got democracies, communist governments, socialist governments, and even monarchy. Okay, so this slide basically is to impress upon us the great diversity in Southeast Asia. Okay, so this is where we're going to jump into the lecture for today, or the discussion for today. Southeast Asia and the great powers. Okay, so scholars, especially in the United States, in recent years have realized that it represents a geographically very significant region of great big power competition. Okay, so it's no longer about big power competition in Europe or in the Middle East, but Southeast Asia is slowly emerging as a theater of great power competition. And of course, we're talking about the United States and China. It is also generally viewed as a successful experiment in regional conflict regulation and cooperation. I don't want to go too much into details, but by and large, scholars of Southeast Asia and even scholars outside Southeast Asia would view Southeast Asia as generally viewed as a successful experiment. Of course, there are intra-Southeast Asian conflicts, as we will talk about them later, but generally, okay, it is quite successful. Okay, and this notion of ASEAN centrality, I just want you guys to keep this at the back of your mind, especially some of you who have the intention of become policymakers in the future. Okay, whenever you go to Southeast Asia, okay, when you participate in diplomatic meetings, this term ASEAN centrality would appear. Okay, and I'll talk about it later, what it means. Okay, but basically, to use a very broad definition, it is central, a leading role, okay, ASEAN to play a leading role in the regional architecture. You know what's an architecture? Okay, it's like a political landscape. Okay, so ASEAN would be in the middle of it all. Okay, this diagram, I can assure you, okay, comes from the internet. Okay, it has been plagiarized so many times by political scientists, okay, that it really doesn't matter who is the first guy who came up with this map. Okay, you can easily find it. Okay, so what I meant in ASEAN centrality basically means all these big regional forums, okay, you have got ASEAN in the center. Okay, the 10 countries, 10 Southeast Asian countries comprising of what we know as Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So you've got ASEAN plus 3, East Asia Summit, ARF. So this gives you the kind of sensing in which, so ASEAN is not irrelevant. It is very much plugged in into the global system, global international relations system. Okay, a brief history. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it isn't that long ago. Okay, 1967, it was formed, the original 5 countries, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand. And 3 years later, they declared this zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. What this zone means, what this idea means is basically we don't want the great powers, and who can tell me who were the great powers during that period? Who were the 2 big great powers fighting it out? US and the Soviet Union, yes. Okay, so it was the battle between the communist-led Soviet Union, okay, and the capitalist-led United States. Okay, so you had this big superpower competition, and what ASEAN, the 5 countries who came out with, who founded ASEAN, said we don't want superpower competition in our region. We want it to be, we declare it as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. Okay, but it's one thing to declare, it's another thing that it is really peaceful, free, and neutral. Okay, and over the years, even up till today, you see big powers all trying to impose some kind of political will on the region, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, so you've got this other treaty that's being signed in February 1976, and then you've got other countries joining in the subsequent years. Okay, and all these again are some of the so-called highlights of what happened in Southeast Asia. You don't need to remember too much of it, except to note that most recent, if you want to be current, okay, you need to remember what happened in June 2019. Okay, when the United States came out with this Indo-Pacific strategy, okay, and they wanted to sort of get ASEAN to sort of buy into it. ASEAN, basically, the Southeast Asian countries basically came out with their version of the Indo-Pacific. Okay, and what a creative version it is called the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Okay, so basically it's trying to tell the United States, okay, that we agree with you that there is this Indo-Pacific, but we want to interpret your view based on our own interests and on what we view the region ought to be like. Okay, so this ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So what next? Okay, some historical conflicts. Okay, so I did mention earlier that many people view ASEAN as generally a successful experiment in sort of multilateral regionalization. However, there are conflicts. However, these conflicts didn't really spill out into large-scale war. Of course, the Vietnam-Cambodia war was quite serious. Okay, but by and large, ASEAN will look at itself and say, hey, yeah, we had some conflicts over the years, but generally we are okay. Okay, so again, depending on how you sort of set the bar, okay, but these are some historical conflicts, and some of it are actually still ongoing. Okay, I just want to talk about some characteristics of ASEAN. So we talk about Southeast Asia. Now let's focus on ASEAN. And this, okay, so ASEAN means Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It is often confused with Southeast Asian countries. Some people use it interchangeably. I don't want to confuse us over here, okay, but what I want to impress upon us is when we talk about Southeast Asia, it is very hard not to talk about this association that all 10 Southeast Asia countries are part of. Okay, it's almost like a membership club. Think of it as a membership club, like a sports club. Okay, so ASEAN is like a sports club. You've got all these individual countries doing their own thing. At the same time, they come together as a club to do other things. Okay, so think of it with this analogy. Okay, some characteristics, and why I want to highlight these characteristics, because these are important in how we understand what ASEAN is like, and consequently what Southeast Asia is like. Okay, so the first point is that ASEAN is an organization of sovereign states. So this is very important, remember. Okay, each of these 10 countries, notwithstanding the fact that they have come together in a club, they remain distinct from each other. So it's not a case where you come together, you've got like a single ASEAN community. So it's not like the EU. The best example, counter example is the EU. That you have got EU states coming together and they almost have like got a supra-national character. But in this case, it is still very much 10 individual ASEAN states. Okay, so it's not a happy band of brothers. Okay, because if it were, there would be no need for ASEAN. So it's almost like a club. Okay, in which the members disagree, but yet they sort of agree to come together. Okay, so this is something to confuse us all. Okay, just keep that in mind. If you're confused, it's okay. Okay, because scholars like myself who have studied ASEAN over the years continue to be confused. So it's perfectly fine. Okay, second point, ASEAN works by consensus. Basically, for any motion or any ruling to be passed, all 10 would have to agree. If anyone dissents from it, you cannot pass that rule. So it's again like the sports club example. So long as one member says, I disagree, this doesn't suit my interest. Okay, whatever law, whatever rule that you want to pass cannot go through. Okay? ASEAN centrality and neutrality, I talked a bit about earlier, and we'll come to that in the last section of slides, but just keep that in mind. The point is that ASEAN wants to be in the center of everything, and at the same time, it wants to stay neutral when it comes to great power competition. Okay, we want to be in the center, but we want to stay neutral. Is that possible? Okay, think about it. And last point, and this is linked to the first point, ASEAN is not a substitute for the individual nation state. So you always see these 10 ASEAN leaders, and I still recall some years ago when Donald Trump attended one of these ASEAN meetings, he couldn't quite figure out how to actually hold hands. If you still remember, okay, he was like, should it be this way or, okay, but trust me, ASEAN leaders are very adept in linking their hands and holding. They've been doing it for the last 50 odd years. Okay, so, but notwithstanding all these very friendly, hand-holding gestures, maybe we should do one later and see how it works. It is no substitute for a nation state. That means, in other words, every country has their own interests to pursue. Okay, and they can pursue these interests, okay, if they wanted to, without consulting other states. Okay, so it's not like a sports club where you need to discuss. You actually don't need to discuss. Okay, it will be good if you discuss, but there is no obligation. It doesn't oblige, okay, these nation states to actually consult with one another. Okay, so these, I start seeing, okay, there are a lot of contradictions starting to appear. Okay, let's move on and okay, so I don't want to go too much about this. This is very theoretical. If you guys, some of you in your graduate school, if you write a thesis, I'm happy to send the slides over and you could sort of copy these things. So I'll just move on. Okay, but what I just want to highlight is that this idea of being neutral is very problematic. Because what does it mean to stay neutral? Okay, and how do you sort of stay neutral when your interests are so different? Okay, so if you've got 10 countries, if a big country, say country A, wants to court a particular country and the country views its interests as very much linked to country's A cultivation, then, but which is against what another ASEAN country has, can they speak? Okay, so it creates all sorts of complications. What does neutrality really mean? Okay, during the Cold War, okay, I mentioned this earlier, that during the Cold War, ASEAN wanted to be neutral. We didn't want the Soviet Union and the United States to come to the region and create sort of proxy wars in the regions. So we sort of came together and developed some kind of mechanisms that will bind, okay, Southeast Asia together. So that was really to preserve their national identities. And mind you, during that period, a lot of Southeast Asia countries were newly formed countries, newly independent countries. So they knew that if they could not find a means to sort of protect themselves, the big powers would come and recolonize them. Okay, so that was really part of the reason why they came together. The reason why they came together wasn't so much attraction towards each other, but because fear of the external powers. Okay, so these are some interesting developments from the post-Cold War till the present, and I think that the last two will be the two big points that you guys are probably more interested. Okay, the US pivot to Asia some 10 years ago under the Obama administration, and China's growing assertiveness. What does it mean for Southeast Asia? And the big question again, can ASEAN remain neutral? Can you sort of stay neutral in between the two great powers? Okay, ASEAN centrality, again, this is quite technical. I don't want to go through. Okay, but I want to argue that, okay, and this is an interesting point made by the former permanent secretary of Singapore's foreign ministry. He said, it is an acknowledgement of ASEAN's weakness vis-a-vis the major powers and a means of turning that weakness into some kind of advantage. So because ASEAN views itself as weak, you need to get other members together. You know, it's like you're in the playground and you have got the big bullies around. The only way you can survive against those bigger players is if you rally other smaller players or maybe some middle players into your team. Okay, so we recognize we are weak, therefore we need one another. But that doesn't mean we like each other. Okay? Okay, I'll just skip this slide because I want to go to and some of these slides later on, if you have questions, I can always refer. I don't want to go into these analogies at work because I think this will help us understand ASEAN in the last 10 minutes that I have. Okay, so there are 4 analogies that I want to use so that we can sort of understand how ASEAN works. Okay, one is the fence sitter, second is the elephants and the grass, third is the bus driver, and last but not least, the pivot. Let me just take each one. Let me go through each. Yeah, ASEAN and fence sitter. So we mentioned about neutrality, and a lot of people say, so does neutral mean sitting on the fence? Okay, it sounds very, it's the image of being neutral, meaning basically we just sit on the fence. We don't take sides, which sounds very good in theory, but how is it done in practice? Okay, so this ASEAN declaration, okay, is a very nice, broad statement representing collective will of the nations of Southeast Asia. Okay, for some of our clubs over here represented, if you want to get good slogans, okay, you can always check out the language used in ASEAN webpage. Okay, slogans that will tell you the story of peace, harmony, trust, mutual respect, stuff like that. Okay, so it seems very nice. Okay, but the unspoken objective, and this you have to quote Singapore's founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the unspoken objective behind all those wonderful words was to gain strength through solidarity ahead of a power vacuum that will come with an impending British and later possible US withdrawal. So there was a very real political calculation in why ASEAN decided to come together. Because the British was about to leave, the US may withdraw after the Vietnam War. So how? What happens? Okay, and you had the threat of communism from China back then and also the Soviet Union. So hence, ASEAN countries decided, okay, we better come together, otherwise we will hang separately. Okay, well, many of us often equate fence sitting with that of an utterly neutral spectator, one who is unwilling to take a stand. The reality of it is that Southeast Asian countries are not passive recipients of great power competition back then and now. So neutrality does not mean that Southeast Asia have no point of view. Okay, and it doesn't mean that they are entirely passive. Okay, a lot of scholars have done work on how Southeast Asia tries and shape the behavior of great powers to its own advantage, okay, while continue to sort of remain neutral in a very broad sense. Okay, the second analogy would be the elephants and the grass. Okay, this African proverb, yeah, you guys probably have heard it. When elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. Okay, there are various variations of it, some a bit more vulgar than others. But anyway, I'll use this. Okay, when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So what it means is basically what it means if great powers decide to bash one another, okay, to bring their conflict into the theater, okay, they will inevitably trample on the grass, and the grass will suffer. Okay. However, let us also recognize that major powers, while they do have a big say, do not always have all or the final say in geopolitical matters. Okay, so this is something we need to recognize. ASEAN, certainly, if we consider the United States and China's bringing their geopolitical conflict into the region, does it mean that ASEAN countries will be trampled on like the grass? Not necessary. Okay, ASEAN countries have found ways to sort of use this competition to their advantage. Okay, and one Brookings scholar managed to make this comment: great power competition isn't all bad for Southeast Asia since it can provide opportunities to hedge and secure benefits from rival camps. Okay, so I think this is, I'm sure this analogy, this is something all of us are familiar. Okay, you are sort of able to use this competition to your own advantage, provided okay, you have the wit to recognize those advantages. Okay, the third analogy. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. Okay, is that of the driver. I use this because I've got 4 boys at home and they love playing with Tayo trucks. Okay, so I'm just decided to use this. Okay, what does this driver analogy means? Okay, the analogy is that Southeast Asia is in the driver's seat. You know, like a bus driver, you're in the driver's seat. Okay, what does the driver do? He drives you to your location. In other words, he decides where their passengers want to go. Okay, he takes charge. Okay, when the passenger hops on the bus, okay, it's the driver who leads on. Okay, one fundamental shift, and this is something to note, from the Cold War to the post-Cold War era, is that Southeast Asia has moved from a period where it once avoided the big powers to now engaging the big powers. So in the past, during the Cold War, it is almost a case, again I'm simplifying it, where Southeast Asia don't want the big powers in their bus. You say, no, please don't come on board because you're going to mess up my bus. But now, it's different. Southeast Asia, you use the bus analogy, want the big powers on the bus. In fact, the more the merrier. Okay, not just US and China, but Japan, India, Korea, EU, the more the merrier. Just come into our region so long as you pay the fare. Okay, just come on board. Okay, your conflict is fine, just come on board. We want you in the region. Okay, so this is one fundamental shift. Okay, and what this driver analogy means basically is that with all these members on board, Southeast Asia is able to shape, okay, their preferences to their advantage. Okay, of course, the question can be asked, and many scholars have also use this as a form of criticism. Okay, are we in the driving seat, but you are no longer the person who decides where to go? That means it's the major players coming on board, and sort of you are just merely the chauffeur. Okay, I don't know. Okay, it is very hard to say whether Southeast Asia are really deciding on the direction, or are they just purely chauffeurs deciding where you want to go. If you're a big country, which one do you prefer? I don't know, but I know for myself, if I get on a taxi, okay, I do want the driver to decide, to listen to me. Okay, I wouldn't want a driver to decide where he wants to go. Okay, that would be quite terrible. Okay, imagine you get an Uber cab and the driver decides to take you wherever he wants to go. Okay, so think about it. Okay, big powers, certainly they want the driver to be a very passive driver. Of course, the driver has its own intentions, but if you could use the analogy, so long as they pay the fare, does it really matter, okay, where they go? Okay, so long as they pay the fare at the end of the day. Okay, and this is what countries have been doing, especially countries, economic giants like China. As long as you pay, it's okay. We are quite happy to have your investments. Okay, so this is the analogy of a driver. Okay, with the last 2 minutes left, I'm going to talk about ASEAN, the pivot. Okay, this is a rather new analogy because I thought of it myself, so it may not be out there. Okay, but what I want to use this pivot. Okay, so imagine this pivot. Okay, no prizes for guessing who the pandas and the eagle represents. Okay, so imagine this balance of power. Okay, between these two animals. Okay, and Southeast Asian countries, assuming that Southeast Asia countries believe, okay, again this is an assumption, believe that their interest are best served being in the middle. Okay, whether you call it neutral or whether you call it not taking sides or whether you call it equidistance, doesn't matter. Okay, that their interests are best being achieved when this seesaw is at equal balance. Okay, this is an assumption. Okay, so what happens if the panda decides to lean back a little bit? What do you think Southeast Asian countries should do? Okay, lean forward to where? Okay, if the panda decides to lean back and sort of put his weight, the Southeast Asian countries in the center should move towards the eagle. And if the eagle decides to, lean back, where do you think Southeast Asia countries will go? The panda. Okay, so I use this pivot analogy to highlight the fact that assuming, and this is again an assumption, Southeast Asia countries view their interests best served being in the middle, then clearly whenever one country makes a certain move, Southeast Asia countries will have to sort of move in tandem to ensure that the seesaw goes back to balance. Okay, but this is where the problem comes. Okay, the problem is there is not one Southeast Asian country, there are 10. Okay, imagine 10 little creatures sitting there, all having to move in either, in tandem, that's the best term. Okay, be it in this direction or in that direction or in different directions. Okay, because their interests are all very different. Okay, so you see the complicated character of Southeast Asia. How do we sort of find that equilibrium again amidst great power rivalry? Okay, and what is at stake? I want to argue, we are almost out of time. Okay, just allow me to finish these 2 slides. What is at stake for ASEAN and Southeast Asia is about the extent of which, okay, this is definitely the best way to get your teacher's attention. Okay. Okay, what is at stake for ASEAN and Southeast Asia is about the extent of which it is able to make free choices without having to choose exclusively among the 2 powers. So I think this is the important thing. If you were from Southeast Asia, okay, do you have the freedom to make choices without being pressured or coerced or forced to choose one over the other? Of course, if you feel that moving in a particular direction is in your interest, so be it. Okay, but the last thing you want is to move in a direction that is not in your interest, but because you're forced to do so. Okay, and the second question, or second point, I think this should be the conclusion. Ultimately, Southeast Asia countries, in my view, would choose the side which does not force them to choose. Okay, I don't know whether this statement makes sense or whether it's basically stating the obvious. Okay, but they will choose the side which does not force them to choose. Okay, the greater autonomy you give Southeast Asia, more likely they would choose that side. Okay, with that, I've come to the end. We've got good 30 minutes of questions. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
So we do have some time for questions, and I'm going to ask that if you have a question, wait until I can get this microphone to you so that we can get it on the video. So, and say who you are, if you would, and then ask the question. So first one back here. Maybe you can meet me halfway. So.
I can project my voice.
We need you on the mic.
Hello. Yeah, you can hear it. All right, Jose Torres, faculty in the geography department. I was thinking of the country of Timor-Leste, or East Timor. Is there a spot for that country in ASEAN, or is there just no interest?
Short answer, no.
All right, thank you.
It's too problematic.
What do you mean? You mean there's no place for...
I don't know. I mean, there is almost very little. I mean, there has been occasional talk about Timor-Leste joining ASEAN. Certainly, I think for the Southeast Asian Games, sports, I believe Timor-Leste is in. But in terms of this ASEAN umbrella, I think there is very little appetite to include. In fact, the big question now is whether should ASEAN start excluding members who... So it's almost like, again, to use a club membership. If you do not pay your dues, if you don't act like a proper member of the club, are you still allowed to remain at the club? So now there is talk of excluding some countries from these 10 countries because it has become so problematic, the dynamics. Certainly, in the most recent case, Myanmar was not being invited to the ASEAN foreign ministers meeting. So certainly they're still part of ASEAN 10, but if this continues for the next 2-3 years, what does it mean for Myanmar's membership in ASEAN?
If I can elaborate on that. Myanmar suffered a coup in February of last year. And as a result, in October for the ASEAN ministers meeting, they weren't invited to come. My question was that a consensus decision?
No. Okay, so no consensus. So ASEAN is interesting. Okay, there's one point I didn't mention. One fundamental, very sacrosanct principle of ASEAN is non-interference. Okay, because so non-interference into the matters, into the domestic affairs of other countries. Okay, so this creates a sort of a very interesting situation because technically speaking, what happens in Myanmar stays in Myanmar. Okay, yes, it's a coup. You know, the junta was not a legitimate government. They should not be doing those things. They should not. The way they came to power was wrong. But if you go strictly by the principle of non-interference, actually, you could basically do what you want in your own country. Okay, however, I think morally it gave a very bad taste and very sour taste. So I think there are some countries, certainly Singapore was one of the, and maybe Malaysia if I recall correctly, and even Indonesia, okay, didn't want Myanmar to be part of this, to be part of the foreign ministers meeting, because they felt that this kind of, the junta regime was not legitimate. Other countries, and most notably Cambodia, was quite okay. In fact, Hun Sen just met the Myanmar general a few weeks ago. So I think you've got different appetites for different kinds of political regimes. Okay, but as questions like that show, ASEAN is certainly not united, and there is no clear consensus when it comes to questions like that. So the issue of Myanmar, I think I mentioned in my slide, will be one challenge of ASEAN unity. Can it stay united? Evidently, the issue of Myanmar has sort of shown up some of the existing frictions and disagreements within Southeast Asia.
Thank you. Next question should come from Jenks High School. From Jenks? Okay. Please say your name.
I'm William Ford from the Jinx High School ISP. I was wondering what manner of immediate threats you would say are posed on ASEAN in context to the growing tensions between external nations and their neutrality.
Okay, so what are the immediate threats to ASEAN?
Yes.
Okay, the way I see it, I think right now the challenge is really, and this goes back to my project that I've been doing here on rules-based order, where for the longest time, at least after the post-World War II, the rules of the international system have been set up and very much being underwritten by the United States. So in other words, the United States have created this whole very elaborate system of rules to ensure the peace and the countries are able to sort of come together. Scholars call it a liberal international order. What it means, basically means that countries are able to come participate in nation building, participate in international politics together. However, the question is, with China's rise, is China trying to sort of revamp this rules-based order into something more Chinese-centric? Of course, the Chinese will tell you that the rules set by America are to basically benefit America. Okay, so ASEAN, for a very long time, has been very comfortable with that kind of blueprint where you have got the American global rules-based order, and very much, I would say, in Southeast Asia, it's America's security presence. Okay, that has allowed Southeast Asian countries to sort of develop without fighting one another. Okay, so it's almost like having a policeman in your house or within that big club to ensure that members of the club do not misbehave against one another. Okay, because mind you, in the early years of Southeast Asia countries, and even up till today, okay, countries in Southeast Asia disagree over many things. So America's police or security presence allowed them to sort of flourish, do their own stuff without being threatened by their neighbors. Okay, but now that the United States presence may not be always taken for granted, and some would say even in recent years don't seem to be as committed in the region, what are the other alternatives? So China, okay, enter China, its economic presence, its diplomatic presence have made it a very strong contender to America's presence. So I would say, if to answer your questions in a very simple way, it is about trying to ensure that countries in Southeast Asia can continue to make decisions without being forced to take sides either towards the United States or towards China. That will be the big overarching sort of threat. Yeah.
Next question.
I could take two questions as well, then we could. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Gabriel Tiong from Jinx ISP. So you say ASEAN is a pivot right now. So which side is it leaning towards at this time? Like, do you have an idea?
All right. Maybe we'll take two questions with that.
I'm Diego Tejada, and I'm also with Jinx ISP. And my question was, you talked about how if a member country of ASEAN disagrees with the decision they make, that it does not go through. So how often do the member countries of ASEAN disagree, and how often do they meet?
Okay, great. So two very good questions. I'll answer the second question first. Okay, how often do they meet? I don't have exact numbers, but it's at a few hundred times a year. So that's a lot of meetings. Okay, I don't know now with Zoom whether it's more or less. Maybe people have more things to do or just call a Zoom meeting. I don't know how they count Zoom meetings. But anyway, more importantly, your question is how often do they disagree? So I mentioned that Myanmar issue. One very clear sign, and this goes back right to almost 10 years ago, 2012 if I'm not wrong, when Cambodia was the chair. Interestingly, Cambodia is the chair again this year. So by the way, the chair is a rotating chair. So it goes by alphabet. Okay, so Cambodia, and then 10 years later, we will come back to Cambodia. During that year, there was a very big conflict over the South China Sea issue. It still is, okay, but back then it was and let me explain. So during that year, during the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, they wanted to have a joint communique. So at the end of each meeting, you need a joint communique. Okay, most of the times, these communiques are usually written in advance. Nothing controversial. Okay, it's usually motherhood statements, stuff that all countries can all agree. Say we want peace, we want ASEAN centrality, we don't want big powers to sort of come in, and then maybe we just highlight one or two flashpoints. Okay, but that year was very notable for the fact that the rest of the ASEAN countries, I believe, the rest of the 9 countries, wanted to include the South China Sea as a conflict in that communique. That means, they discuss it, so if you discuss, you should include it. However, that year, Cambodia, under the influence of China, refused to allow that South China Sea conflict to be put in the meeting report. So it's almost like saying, it's not a problem. It's just like just a normal conversation. It's not a problem. Okay, so in the end, for that year, they could not issue any joint communique. Okay, so think about it. Something as easy as issuing a joint communique, because it stays the same generally, couldn't, because the Cambodian chair said no, we don't want that statement to go in. Okay, and in the end, they could not do it because one country, okay, in this case the chair, and obviously the chair would have some influence on the agenda setting, decides to say no. Okay, so that is one example. And certainly a very serious one, because up till today, we all still remember this example. Okay, and the question is really not on the low-hanging fruits. Usually those things on climate change, pandemic, people have no issue on, but it's on territorial issues. Okay, and this is something that maybe I didn't highlight. Territorial issues, ASEAN are very sensitive about. Okay, because it concerns their own sense of nationhood. To the first question on pivot, as of now, whose side it is leaning right on, I will want to point you to a survey done by Singapore's Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. The results just came out, in fact, yesterday, on the perceptions of the state of Southeast Asia and perceptions of US and China. I think the broad understanding right now is that countries view China as a major presence. Okay, all countries agree that China's presence has grown, okay, but they are concerned. Okay, anxiety over China's presence have also grown. Okay, does that mean they will automatically shift to the eagle? Not necessary, because countries are also concerned that America's staying power may not be as sustainable as before. Okay, so it's now a case where, if you ask me, Southeast Asia countries would probably prefer middle powers, who have a geographical stake in the region, like Australia, Japan, India, okay, Indonesia, but it's part of Southeast Asia, even South Korea, to sort of bring them in, because you can't sort of only move with the major powers, okay, because one is starting to be very scary, the other one presence may not be that sustainable, okay, because of its own domestic problems. Okay, so I'll just leave it as that. Okay, thank you. Any more questions?
I'm Lauren Cargill, and I'm also from Jenks High School. I'm very interested in China and U.S. relations in Southeast Asia, and I was wondering specifically how Southeast Asia has reacted to China's kind of militarization, so to speak, in the South China Sea, and if that pertains to Southeast Asia at all, or if I'm a little bit far-fetched with that. Yeah.
Thank you. You certainly know a bit of what's happening in Southeast Asia. Yes, a lot of concerns, because essentially what these militarization activities do is that it limits the freedom of navigation in the regions. And a lot of Southeast Asia economy thrives on trade. So if let's say, so I give you an example, some years ago, I think in 21/7, China did a ADIZ. It's basically an imaginary sort of zone designating that this is our airspace area, okay, and requiring aircraft to sort of identify themselves, okay, around the East China Sea. So that got a lot of countries concerned, because what does that mean in practice? It means that, okay, if you sort of do an ADIZ or this, and for South China Sea, some of you may know, is that 9-dash line. Okay, if you look at maps, Chinese maps especially, they have always drawn this 9-dash line that goes all the way down from Hainan down all the way to almost touching Indonesia and up again. Okay, and China has not clarified. Okay, so it's like a 9-dash line, but does this belong to you? Does this not belong to you? So Southeast Asian countries are naturally concerned. Okay, it's almost like if your neighbor sort of draws an imaginary fence, or maybe decides to build some stuff around your house and sort of claiming, well, he didn't say it belongs to his, but you can see that a lot of the stuff are his property. How would you feel? So I think that is the chief concern, that it will limit Southeast Asia choices. Never mind whether there is oil under the sea or not. Okay, that one is very hard. Some people make a lot of predictions, but even if we put that aside, the point is that if that doesn't belong to you, or if your neighbor claims it as theirs without going through some form of legal arbitration, what does it mean for your own sense of sovereignty? Okay, and mind you, in Southeast Asia, territorial sovereignty is very, very important. Okay, so I think the biggest challenge to Chinese militarization activities in Southeast Asia, I think, would be a case where countries in Southeast Asia find themselves being hemmed in by Chinese activities. And to them, it basically limits. And that's why they welcome, America's presence. Because at least when you sail past, and America have made no secret that we will sail wherever we want, okay, whenever we want. Okay, that's what Americans do. Okay, it's almost like saying, okay, you say this is your territory, fine, we'll just walk through it. Yeah. Okay, and that riles up the Chinese also, unfortunately.
Let me ask a question.
Yes.
You mentioned the United States. The United States has been a little strange recently, both internally,
Yes.
as domestically, as well as internationally. Can you talk about how Southeast Asian nations view the U.S. in the last, say, 8 to 10 years? Of course, there was the Obama pivot to Asia. Then there was an abrupt withdrawal under President Trump.
Right.
Now we have a new.
Yep.
So if you would address,
Okay.
how does the United States look
Sure.
to Southeast Asia?
Okay, I'll just mention a couple of quick points because there's so much to mine for that question. That is a huge PhD thesis question in it. So I shall not attempt to venture an exhaustive answer, but just look. So from the Obama administration, I think we're very clear. Obama has talked a lot about pivot to Asia, and his presence in Southeast Asia is certainly very welcome. Okay, and by the way, for Southeast Asia, appearing at meetings is important. Okay, even though nothing substantive might be discussed, okay, but appearance is very important. You need to come. Okay, being there, attending the meeting is part of the is part of the game. Okay, however, one problem with Obama is that there was very little action to sort of back it up. In that sense, we talk about pivot to Asia. Yes, he came, a lot of diplomacy, says the right things, portray a very Southeast Asia friendly image. But in terms of containing China, or in terms of defending Southeast Asia from back then, so I think between 2010 onwards, okay, China was already starting to become very aggressive in its island building. Obama didn't do anything. Okay, I mean, he apparently he said he told President Xi that you should not. Apparently, President Xi promised him, okay, that he would not build any more. Okay, but when he did build more islands, okay, in the spread list, the U.S. administration did nothing. So basically, it gave the idea that, well, you came here, you talk a good talk, you keep up the appearances, but when China does not fulfill what it promised to, the United States basically just carry on watching. The Trump administration was interesting because one of Trump's signature policies in Southeast Asia was what he did not do. Okay, basically pull out from the TPP, which for the longest time, okay, many countries in Southeast Asia, including Singapore, especially Singapore, was pushing very hard for. Okay, but Trump basically put the United States out on the first day of his presidency. But what Trump did, and this is where it gets a bit complicated, and many will remember in his dinner with President Xi, he actually caught a bomb. He decided to bomb Syria while having dinner with President Xi. So that was a very clear signal that President Trump was willing to do something, take action literally, okay, and say, okay, these are the red lines that the Syrian government has crossed, we will go in and bomb. So Trump was certainly much harder on China than Obama, notwithstanding the fact that Obama came to Southeast Asia, participated in Southeast Asia more than Trump. The Trump administration had very little presence in Southeast Asia. If you look at the number of meetings, they did a very high-level meeting in Singapore, but that was the Trump-Kim summit, and they really did another round in Hanoi, again the Trump-Kim summit. But other than these two signature presence, there was very little to talk about. Biden, okay, and I have to caveat it with the fact that it's only a year or so into the Biden presidency, so it's still a bit early to say, but so far Biden has seemed to have a much more multilateral approach. Certainly he has been courting allies in the region, but one might say he seems to be looking at democratic allies, countries like Japan, Australia, and India. So Southeast Asia, there is some kind of activity going on, but not as explicit as yet. So it really remains to be seen. So overall, taking in totality, all these the last three political regimes in the United States, as a Southeast Asia, okay, and this I'll speak from my own observation, what can you conclude? Okay, one, okay, America's presence, yes, it comes and it goes. Okay, can we trust it? Can we trust the US to remain in the region? Okay, because different presidency would have different agendas, would have different, okay, obviously right now that there is bipartisan agreement that China represents the big threat. But who is to say that that threat may not change? Okay, well, I don't think it will change for a while. Okay, but then again, the very fact of democracy, you have to respond to your own domestic constituents. Okay, so that is something that raises the staying power of the United States in the region. The second is really also about what the US can do in the region. Okay, so it's one thing to stay in the region, it's the second thing about what it can do. And the US has a lot of other global commitments, okay, including the one in Russia, as we are talking right now. Okay, so I think it's really a case of where the United States decide to put their chips. The third point I want to make is that there is a concern that US interest in the region is because of China and not because they are genuinely interested in Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia countries are also aware, hey, if tomorrow this China threat vanishes, where would the United States decide to move its priorities? Okay, so these are some things to keep in mind.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Thank you, sir. Sometimes,
Introduce yourself.
oh, yes, sorry. My name is Daniel Holting. I'm an undergraduate in the geography department studying global studies. Sometimes federations form in the face of outside pressure or in the need to maintain order in their region. With the concerns about whether or not U.S. priorities will stay in the region or increasing outside Chinese pressure in the region, is there a chance that ASEAN will grow into a stronger order or at least solidify on how the region acts as towards its outside relations?
Thank you, Daniel. Maybe, are there any more questions? I could probably take 2 questions at one go then. Okay. Wow, I see 4 questions. We can have conversations after this, but...
I'm going to whoever's close.
Okay, why not all of you just ask your question, but make it very short, like 15 seconds.
My name is Jeremy Hicks. I'm a global studies major.
Okay.
With Asians' power consisting of unification of Southeast Asia,
has there been an overall negative withdrawal from Myanmar not being further invited?
Okay. So it's the Myanmar issue and whether Southeast Asia is affected by that. Okay.
Hello, my name is Ellie Schaefer. I'm here in the Global Studies Master's Program. My question is about nation branding in regards to Singapore.
Nation branding.
Yes, and if Singapore is a founding member of ASEAN and therefore was setting some of the paradigms and ideas and values that ASEAN is supporting, how is that relationship in the reverse? How is ASEAN now impacting Singapore's nation brand, or how has it over the past 50 years?
Okay. Wow, okay. Okay, last question. Now I probably asked for too much. But those are very good questions. Okay, maybe a last question? Okay. Lady over there, so sorry. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Sophia Smith, and I'm also from Jinx High School. So I was curious, Southeast Asia is kind of at the crux of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and that it's kind of where Belt and Road meet. How does that role kind of impact China's activity in Southeast Asia?
Whoa, that's a big question. Okay, I think I swallowed up too much. That's what I could. Okay, let's try from. Go for the easy one first. They all look so difficult. Okay, I'll take the one on ASEAN since basically we've been talking about ASEAN. Is there a chance that ASEAN will grow stronger? I think that's precisely what ASEAN policymakers are asking right now. Is there a way where we can grow more cohesively internally as opposed to sort of our strengths is based on our weaknesses and sort of we have to constantly look at what other powers think. So ASEAN is trying to find some form of cohesiveness within. I don't know how much the pandemic has affected ASEAN. My sensing is that we are trying at the very least to try and open travel borders within ASEAN because it demonstrates some kind of solidarity. But even then, you are seeing that different countries have got different rules. So it's very hard for ASEAN to sort of come together and say, let's work in unison. It's almost a case where you've got different countries with different priorities, all wanting to do the same thing. So my short answer is that you need to find a lowest common denominator. What is that lowest common denominator? Right now, everybody talks about a pandemic. Maybe ASEAN could come with some form of like vaccine sort of support for one another, which I think some of countries like Singapore we are doing. But beyond that, I'm not very optimistic that ASEAN can sort of grow stronger as an institution because some of these agreements it has among one another are still very fundamental. Okay, I'll take the question on China Belt and Road and how does that affect Southeast Asia. I think it affects Southeast Asia in a way that because a lot of these Belt and Road projects are about Chinese economy pushing out, building infrastructure, but it affects Southeast Asia in different ways. So countries like, for instance, who require infrastructure, certainly China has got some kind of substantial leverage because it is able to go in, able to build its infrastructure. Like Singapore, we don't have infrastructure to be built per se. So in that sense, Singapore has been talking about financial services. So yes, a lot of the BRI, some of the money goes channeled through Singapore. But I think the bigger, more strategic question about Southeast Asia with regards to China's BRI is really a case of, is China using it as economic statecraft? Okay, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this idea of debt trap diplomacy. Okay, what happens if China goes in, into some of the countries that it has gone in, built projects, and these countries are unable to pay back the loan? What happens? Okay, so those are the concerns. Whether will that economics, investments, infrastructure turn out to be something more strategic? Will it mean in the future China being able to base some of its, say, naval assets in other Southeast Asian countries? Already Cambodia already has a Chinese naval base. So what does it mean for the rest of Southeast Asia? The Myanmar issue, I think I've responded. I think the key thing about the Myanmar issue is really it shows up the limitations of Southeast Asia. Because when you cannot have unanimous agreement on a particular policy, basically you can only say we agree to disagree. Okay, and I'm not sure whether if that is the case, then certainly that is not consensus. So Southeast Asian countries are trying very hard, okay, to find some kind of middle ground. Okay, we want Myanmar to be part of us because, okay, it's at least we can sort of keep watch on our fellow brother. Okay, but at the same time, if the country is causing problems, then it becomes very hard to justify the presence in ASEAN. Okay, your last one on Singapore, I really don't know how to answer it. Not because I don't want, but let me give it a try. So, how is ASEAN affecting Singapore in terms of public diplomacy? Is that okay? I think Singapore, okay, is very supportive of ASEAN, okay, because a strong ASEAN, okay, or at least a strong ASEAN in the broad sense is beneficial for Singapore. Okay, as small countries, and I'm sure all of you are aware, if you are the smallest player in the playground, okay, you want as many people to be on your side. Okay, you want as many players to be playing the playground, so that anyone with ulterior motives will not be able to push his agenda too far. So Singapore is a very strong supporter of ASEAN. I mean, for some of us here, you may know, we give out lots of ASEAN scholarships. Okay, we want the best and brightest from ASEAN, and we've got every year many students travel to Singapore to do their college educations, their high school education. So I think we are very much pushing this element of trying to get the best and brightest from ASEAN to Singapore. Okay, sometimes we even give out citizenships after that. So I think it's a case of trying to project a positive image. And I think, if I'm not wrong, okay, I'm not in foreign ministry, but my guess is Singapore is probably one of the most hardworking ASEAN players. Why? Okay, because in many of these ASEAN meetings, you need to draft a communique in English. Okay, so countries like Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, okay, or rather countries with, well, whose working language is English, will have an advantage, okay, writing the sort of agenda. Okay, so I'll leave it as that because I don't have any other insights into the foreign ministry processes. But all I can say is Singapore is very supportive of ASEAN. Okay, obviously for its own interests as well. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you've given us a terrific talk on the importance of Southeast Asia, how the world looks from Southeast Asia, and what it feels like to be the grass, right? And so thank you again very much. We do have a small gift for you from the School of Global Studies and Partnerships. Thank you very much for being here.
Right.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. Good evening.
Good evening. The new Southeast Asia.